Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Joining us today, we have esteemed and legendary astrologer, author, and lecturer, Dr. Bernadette Brady. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
I'm good. I don't quite know if I like the title legendary or not. Infamous. I'll accept infamous.
Infamous. Okay, infamous. We'll change it to infamous. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. And I guess I would love to start this interview by starting at the beginning of your astrological journey. So would you care to share for us where you're from, where you grew up, and how you first began your astrological journey?
It was a fair while back. I hate to admit. I was born in Adelaide, South Australia. And I'm Australian, even though I now live here in Devon, UK. And I spent the first 50 years of my life in Australia, so that's where I became an astrologer. I got into astrology in my late 20s, which is always an interesting age astrologically. And I'd had actually a bad car accident, which just gave me concussion for a couple of weeks, and that was all.
Oh,
and
wow.
I had to lie in a dark. I didn't get any other injuries. I had to lie in a darkened room for about 2 weeks, and so I decided, instead of going mad, I would actually just go for walks inside my own head. And that was really quite an interesting process, because once I came out of that, my I had shifted from the sciences into something else. I started to question all the sciences, which was my background. I was a microbiologist. I was working at Adelaide Children's Hospital. I was, I just saw the world differently. I think that's the simplest way. So I just started exploring non-conventional subjects. I'll use that sort of neutral type of term. And I laugh in retrospect. I had explored several, and I thought, right, I'll get to grips with astrology. I'll give that 6 months, and then I'll move on to the next thing. I was going to, and that was about 1978, I think. I know. Well, and I have not yet finished with astrology.
After all those years.
Hang on a second. So that's quite a few years ago, Yeah, so that's how I got into it, and I just
wow. So that sounds like a pivotal moment for you, that particular accident, and having to take that time alone and to think things through. That's quite a fascinating way, and quite an extreme way as a gateway into thinking about astrology.
It was. I mean, it was sort of a warning, almost like a warning shot across the bows, like to stop. And and on one minute, I feel quite blessed with that, because my life changed direction considerably, because I just started to explore it, and it grew from there, really. I think I was very lucky. I had an aptitude for it, I suppose you could say. I don't know. A love of patterns, a love of exploring, and a love of people. Do you know, like how people work, etc. And I just jumped into it, and I don't quite remember that transition. When we're learning astrology, we learn, house, sign, planet, aspect, and then you try and put it together, and you end up weeping on the floor, and
you think you're getting somewhere, and then you're like, where am I going?
Yeah. And I can remember I bought you got to remember, this is pre-computers, right? This is BC, before computers.
I like
right?
a BC before computers.
Yeah. I bought the Parker's Complete Astrology. And that's why I sent you that photograph of myself with the Parkers. It was great to meet them.
Wonderful.
Derek and Julia Parker, mainly because it had an ephemeris in the back, because you couldn't get ephemerides easily. So I thought, well, that was a sort of all-in-one sort of package. And it was an ABC 101 astrology book. Some of your older listeners or watchers might know it or not. And I worked my way through that, and I was still struggling with it. And then I decided one weekend, to write all the meanings out, like Mercury and Pisces, which we discussed, take Derek and Julia's, cookbook thing, write it all out. I did that for every single thing, the planets, the houses, the charts, the aspect, you know, the whole lot. And I had all these bits of paper, so I decided to look for things that talked about the same theme, but something else. So I cut the paragraphs out and laid them all out, like on the dining room table. I can remember this.
And so then, you started to develop a method, it sounds like. You're right. How do I put these pieces together?
Over one weekend, I went to and I actually saw, I could see the patterns. Do you know? I think that's the best way to do it. I could see the patterns, and I could see that there are nuances within that pattern. And, you know, and then from that point on, really, I could look at a chart and having learnt my basics really thoroughly, I could look at a chart and it would come alive for me. I think that's the easiest way to put it. And there's a similar story. I've talked to other professional astrologers, and they have similar sorts of journeys. Not exactly that, but that sense of when they step into the chart and suddenly they're seeing the patterns, and they don't see the whole chart. They see you sort of go into a loose construing, to use that term, where you just sort of everything's in the mix, and then all of a sudden you'll see the pattern. So I was fortunate to be able to engage with that fairly quickly without necessarily beating my head too much against the wall. and then I just started engaging with astrological communities, and then just everything sort of took off.
Wow, incredible journey, and what an incredible experience to go through. So who were your sources of inspiration as you were developing and going on your journey? Were there any particular astrologers? Were there any, and you've mentioned books as you start to delve in and read more. Was there anyone that comes to mind?
There was, well, I would absolutely always give credit to Derek and Julia Parker, and they wrote cookbook astrology. But the thing is, that back was then, it was because Julia was very much part of the astrological, you know, the got my mind, you know, the AA, not the AA, I've just lost the plot, the faculty of astrological studies. Yeah, she was very central in that. So although it was a cookbook, it was a solid cookbook. Do you know, like there was thinking behind it. So I'd always pay tribute to them, even though the astrological world wouldn't necessarily see them as great groundbreaking astrologers. They were, in that they built a bridge between those who were interested and those, you know. So
I love that. So again, that gateway. So, you know, maybe not the most prominent, but like you said, a bridge, or at least, you know, maybe young astrologers today finding a gateway, regardless of what level that's at, to at least get people over the bridge.
Yeah, that's it. Get them over the bridge into thinking astrologically. So I'd always acknowledge that. And then believe it or not, Robert Zola, and he translated very early in the 90s. He translated Bernati's military astrology from the 13th, 14th century, and he translated it and published it in the Lodge, the UK organization, the Astrological Lodge. And I found that extraordinary. That actually introduced me to medieval astrology, which I found really intriguing. So that sent me onto that journey. And this was before the three Roberts did the hindsight translations, all of the hindsight translations. I don't know if this makes any sense to you.
I think that was that 1993?
Yeah.
I was a child right at that point, but I know the
Robert
dates.
published the Bernati's translation, you know, in the late 80s. So, you know, that was really extraordinary. So that was really an important piece of work. And it was a joy for me meeting these people and forming friendships with them. And I knew Robert really well, and he's a great guy. So there's that side of it. And I've always loved medieval astrology. Not that we can do medieval astrology. We do post-modern medieval astrology, because we're not in their culture. We're in our culture, and we have to nuance it to accept that. So there's the Parkers, there's Zola, and then also in the very early, in the 80s, in the mid 80s, I met Rob Hand, and he was fantastic. I have a dog pounding on the door. So I might have to get up and let the dog in shortly.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. In the mid-80s, I met Rob Hand. I was on an astrological lecture tour through Canada and the USA in the mid-80s. And so I landed in Cape Cod, which is where Rob was based, and they were in the throes of just developing and finishing the first versions of Nova. Now, that probably is not a name you know either, but this was the beginnings. There was a thing called Blue Star, which was astrological software, and then there was Rob's program or Astrolab's program called Nova. And so I stayed with them for about a week or so, and just I was running an astrological practice back in Adelaide, and I was seeing. I would have something like 50 clients on the books waiting to see me. I'd see 3 a day, 5 days a week, bang, 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 bang.
Wow.
So I always had, every night I would have to hand draw all the charts for the next day. So there's 3 lots of clients, 3 lots of charts and predictive work, and
And you were doing all this by hand. I mean, my generation, astrologers today, we don't know we're born because, of course, we've got the great software that you've been involved with, but we can press buttons, and that's why I think at Kepler we are taught to draw charts by hand, and I think that's an important.
It is. I think it is. I mean, I just grew up doing it.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you can imagine when I met up with Rob in Cape Cod, and they were developing Nova.
Wow.
And
I'd love to be a fly on the wall at that time.
I know. I just attached myself to a computer, and ran it. And so, and I bought it, or he gave me a copy. I can't remember. It was on 2 floppy disks. That was the day. You didn't have hard drives. I got back to Australia and bought a computer, which was at an outrageous price, $5,000 for a little computer that had 2 floppy disks. Because it's but the thing is, it did all my client work.
Oh, wow.
And it was really funny because he hadn't configured composite charts for Southern Hemisphere. You couldn't do a composite chart. I'd say, Rob, you didn't have email then, you had a fax machine, right? You sort of like, excuse me, guys, we do have relationships down in the Southern Hemisphere.
Can you help us? We're in Australia.
Yeah. And they were great. They sorted it out very quickly. But so, yeah, in that regard, then Rob Hand was great. And then he came down to Adelaide, might have been about late 80s, early 90s, very early 90s. And to do some, he was coming through. And so we got him to come to Adelaide to do some lectures, and he stayed with us and so on. And he was a bit like me in reverse. He got into the door and he just sort of said, lead me to your computer. You didn't have laptops, you didn't have, So he was just desperate to get back online for things. Not online, there wasn't an online, but to get some work done.
Wow.
So he was doing some stuff, and he'd had a lot of, I said, he had put a lot of files on my machine. By that stage, we had a hard drive, which was really,
how big was that hard drive?
It was probably, I can't remember, but 20 meg was really big, Ben.
Sure.
Really big. I mean, I just bought a new computer today, and it's half a gigabyte, like just a hard drive. So yeah. Anyway, he had to, for his work on his lectures, he had a whole lot of files he put on my machine and stuff. And so when he left, he was saying, "Oh, this is fantastic. It was so wonderful. You let me, people, because this stage, an astrologer having a computer and being computer literate was really rare. He didn't it wasn't there." And he said, "Is there anything I can do? Say, help me. Like if I can help." And he'd put a whole lot of fixed star files from Nova on my desktop. And I said, well, you could leave those files on. I said, I would absolutely acknowledge them. They are the Nova files. And so he did, bless him. And that was the beginning. And talking to a few other friends of mine, that was the beginning that moved me into fixed star work, which I've never really gotten out of. But, and he was, and still is, he is the most generous, warm, open-hearted, big guy I've ever met. in astrology. Do you know, like I think I can genuinely say that about Rob.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. And that actually goes into another question we have, because talking about fixed stars, and of course you have an incredible body of work, and one of the most interesting pieces of your work is the fixed stars. So for you, what first got you interested in fixed stars, and how did that come about for you? Was there a pivotal moment? Was it things you've been thinking about, or how did that come about?
It was a slow growth moment, Callum. But there, Junior Parker said something to me, right back in the beginning of all of this, which really struck. When I published my first book on fixed stars, it really struck me, and I hadn't thought about it. She said it took an astrologer from the southern hemisphere to give us fixed stars. I looked at it and she said, "Well, you can see them," and I thought, "Yes."
That's okay.
What used to irritate me is, we'd be having summer barbecues in Australia, and so you've got this fantastic sky and it's a warm night and twinkly stars everywhere.
I'm not jealous at all coming from England.
No.
I'm not jealous.
and friends and stuff, and you'd get people who weren't astrologers and they'd say, "Well, you're an astrologer, what star is that?" That sort of type of question.
Yeah.
And I'd look and I think, I wouldn't have the faintest idea. And it just got me thinking, because I realized I didn't do astrology in terms of astro meaning stars. I actually did planetology, because it's planets based on the ecliptic.
Right.
And so I went to look at the fixed star books. If in doubt, go to a book. Still nothing online. And what I read there, I wasn't happy with. And I didn't feel I could say to a client, because your Mars is in such and such a degree that you will die in a foreign land with a knife in your back.
The texts are very extreme, very deterministic, and very morbid,
very
and macabre.
fatalistic, and very very extreme. It didn't really fit into the modern consulting room, shall we say? And then researching how they research. I mean, Robson did a book on fixed stars, and he's about the most honest of them. But he says in his book that, honest is the wrong word, but he was the most genuine. He says in his book he's simply drawing on other sources, etc. Whereas other books you'd get would be not talking about their sources, and just really, well, Everton's book on fixed stars was based on one chart, his wife's. So that's a case study. That's not
right.
Not a book on fixed stars. That's a case study. So a lot of frustration there, and then so it really got to me, and I started thinking about it, and I had this. Can I talk about a dream?
Oh, of course. I love hearing about dreams.
Right. So it was in the. I'd just finished. I'd published the Eagle and the Lark Predictive Astrology, and I sort of got that off my chest. Do you know, and was seeing clients every day, teaching astrology classes at night. But this stage, using a computer to generate the work for the clients. So I was getting in front of the bell curve, but working very, very hard as an astrologer, and sniffing around the edges of stars. And then I had a dream, and I actually don't tend to. Well, I know we always dream, but I never remember my dreams. They're very rare, so it's an unusual thing. And I still remember it quite clearly. And basically, I was sort of walking through into an area. It was almost like a jungle of some sort. It wasn't threatening, but there was a building. It wasn't a castle. It's sort of like an Inca place, or some sort of very old structure, but it was covered with sand and dirt and built up. And I started to sort of poke around it, and sometimes the rubbish and build up of earth was only that far from the ceiling. Do you know, it was sort of it was like that sort of thing. And as I was poking around it, this tiny little light, just a tiny little like a little fly, wasn't it? It's just a little light appeared. didn't worry me. And I thought, right. So I kept moving through the building and more of them appeared. So it ended up with me being a Pied Piper-like figure with all these little lights following me.
Wow.
And so I got out of the building. They all just hung around me. And then I woke up. And I realized retrospectively, or at least seems to me, that it was the fixed stars coming into my life.
Wow.
It was the sense of engaging with them. And I for people who know my astrology, I'm very passionate about the fixed stars. It's not some superficial thing on the sideline of my life, you know. I'm very passionate.
And I've heard you, and forgive me if I'm taking your words out of context, but it sounded when you were talking about the fixed stars that I've heard you talk about before, is in that they have their own language, they have their own culture, yes. And we shouldn't be viewing them through the lens of our own sun. I don't know.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. Yes, and that's the thing. So it's almost like it's an astrological moral outrage I have that they're pinned to the ecliptic because it does deny their language. And so I sort of thought, well, what's going on here? And then in researching it, I realized that they're only pinned to the ecliptic by the Greeks. And the Greeks were doing it because they're trying to rationalize the whole of astrology, Ptolemy and Valens, and you know, there's a group of them. And so if you pin it to the ecliptic, then you've got something you can hang it off to. And particularly Ptolemy, who was trying to work out precession. He didn't write about the stars in his Tetrabiblos, not in that regard. He wrote about it in his great work, the Almagest, which is where he's trying to figure out precession, which is his astronomy book. It's not his astrology book. And yet astrologers picked up on that because it's easy to work with the ecliptic. You know, it's easy to say a star is at such a degree of the ecliptic and move on. And yet it's not. And therein lies, this is a personal opinion, that to me is the demise of stars in astrology. When I started to engage and really work on them, I was actually warned by some professional friends not to talk about fixed stars, not to work with the fixed stars, because it would damage my reputation as an astrologer.
Wow. You think as astrologers, I mean, being, you know, in some parts, you know, of mainstream media being ostracized, that there wouldn't be many taboo, in quotes, topics to talk about. So I find that quite strange, really.
That's how bad the fixed stars were held by modern astrologers. That's the state of the reputation of the fixed stars, that if you worked in them, that you would be considered within astrology on the fringe and a bit strange and would not be asked to speak at conferences and things like that.
That's so bizarre to me. What was the reasoning behind that? I mean,
the reasoning was because they were, as you said, they were what was published was deterministic, black and white, and it had no place in the modern consulting room. And it was almost like at that point, and this was the very early 90s, that astrologers were collectively trying to sort of push them under the carpet and just nail it down, and that's the weird stuff and we don't do that. Do you know?
Wow.
That type of feeling. Of course, that didn't stop me. I was just more and more determined then. And so in researching it, just realizing that they weren't considered, they were not pinned on the ecliptic, you know, in their way that they were originally used, or worked with or discussed or thought about. And so then proceeded to unpin them off the ecliptic. And that took quite a lot of a journey. Rob had put in, because of the discussions I had with him, he put in Piran's into Nova, which was great. So that gave me a starting point. And then after my first book on fixed stars, I found another mathematician who would do it precisely the way I wanted it. And that created Starlight, which was then, Starlight was like taking a fuzzy picture and rotating the lens and making it sharp, because the Piran's just done a little bit differently, a little bit more in the way that they were done in antiquity.
I love how, literally, going back to your dream, the literal starlight that you felt going through that period in that dream with the light on you, is as if in some way the stars were speaking to you in some straight, like
I
calling
do,
on you
yeah,
specifically. I don't, that's such a
yeah.
wonderful
It's
dream
a
story.
it's a very powerful dream for me, and
Mm.
I do think that I felt like I was being asked like to lead them out of this dark, dingy, forgotten, neglected area and
Yeah.
bring them into the light. I still feel that. I mean, my partner Darren and we have in the past taken groups out into deserts and by the Red Sea and stuff, just to put astrologers under starry skies for a week every night.
Wow.
And that's very powerful, because I actually believe astrologers have a little spot here saying put sky here, and it's not. Astrology doesn't give you the sky, but we all have that.
Right.
And so when you take them out and put them under stars, you teach them how to see them.
Mm.
It's very powerful, because what happens if you focus on a constellation, just focusing on it, thinking about it, engaging with it, and look at the sky, what will actually happen is a part of the sky, a particular constellation, whatever, it will step forward to you. It will bounce forward. Now, I don't know why it's so, don't know, but it will just it's a two-way dialogue starts to happen. And when you see that happening for others, you know,
it's such a powerful moment. Again, just getting under the stars. Obviously, I grew up in England, so I didn't have a lot of time under and observing the stars, right? But going to places, as you say, and connecting, and it's indescribable. I don't have words for when you're sat outside and I let my mind go and I let my eyes go, and I'm looking at these stars and engaging in some way. But again, it's an indescribable feeling of joy. But I don't know. Again, I have no words for it. I don't know. I can't put any words to the description.
Yes. It's a powerful moment. So that's, I mean, out of all the things I've done in astrology, I think that's the one I'm proudest of, to bring stars back in with Purans, using Purans. I still get astrologers coming up to me at different times, and they're taking my delineations and they're putting them onto ecliptical degrees. I'm just saying, look, you just can't do that. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
You've got to work with Purans, and that's it. If you don't want to work with Purans, right, work with the meaning of ecliptical degrees. It's not stars, it's something else. That's fine. The Moira of the ecliptic, absolutely. You can do all sorts of things like that. That's fine. But if you want to work with the stars, let them be in the sky. Let them. They're not servants of the sun. Do you know? Yeah.
Wonderful.
And that's for me is a really big key thing.
Beautiful.
But the fixed star, my first book took over 10 years of research work.
Wow.
That was huge. I read the Encyclopedia Britannica and extracted every bibliography from that, every biog, sorry. Because you don't need a time of birth to work with Purans. So I could take the date and place and key features of the biog, and I put them all in a database. And then I calculated the Purans for each person. There were thousands. And created a database for that planet with that star in that Puran and linked it to their biog. And then I could query that database by saying, show me all the people who have Mars in Puran with Mirach, for example. And so then I'd get the whole list of biogs. So then I'd read through all the biogs and look for that common essence of what I thought it was. And that would almost like distill it out, and that would give me the essence of the star. And then you've got to run tests on it again. But doing that for 64 stars I worked with through all planets and the sun and the moon. So there's thousands of permutations through, and the dint in the system that I was aware of is that the Encyclopedia Britannica, of course, is biased in its judgment of who to put in it and how they write up a biog. It's very white male, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other figures there, but particularly back then, this was in the 90s, it's probably different now. But that then led to my first book on fixed stars, which Weiser's wonderfully, Betty Weiser published. Betty Weiser was another great most people don't know Betty Wises, but she was a saint because she published my first book on predictive astrology. She would recognize an astrologer's worth, and she'd take a risk on them. Do you know?
Wow, beautiful.
And she was so central to publishing so much really top flight astrology. She worked with Liz Green for a long time. Do you know, like just fantastic woman. It was very sad when she died. You know? Yeah.
Wow.
So there's names that in this astrological community don't know. Well, nowadays, I mean, astrologers, they tend to get their astrology off the internet, don't they? And so you don't tend to sort of drill down on a subject for years and years and years.
Exactly. And the amount of work you put again into the fixed star book and the gift to the astrology community. And it actually puts me on to, which I think is a book every astrologer should have, is a must in your library. Now, as starting off studying and becoming an astrologer, again, the work is wonderful, but what really stood out for me and what made a huge impression on me with this book is literally the fable of the eagle and the lark. And maybe if you'd like to explain a bit about that story. But I think my question would be is why would it be important to have your eagle as strong as possible to give flight as well as the lark to sing? I don't know if that question makes sense, but
it's how a Pisces Mercury lives in the world.
As I said before the recording, that's me. So
yeah. And me. The story when I was growing up as a little kid, you know, sort of you have a mother and a father. And I was blessed. I had a mother and a father. Do you know, like I sort of grew up but having a Mercury in Pisces and being also Pisces sun, really struggled with stuff at school, and it absolutely excel in some areas but be a total zero in others, you know, and just being shattered by that when you're only, you know, a young kid. And my parents basically gave me that fable. They said, look, try as hard as you can, because the basic, and it isn't I've often tried to find the source of it. I grew up with it as part of the narrative that I had from my parents, right? And I knew it was a Native American legend, but I didn't know anything else from that,
right?
But it was basically, it seemed to me with astrology that there's a lot of heavy lifting can be done by studying technique, and using a critical mind and critical thinking, reading, thinking, and it does the heavy lifting. And that's really what I tried to do in my first book on predictive astrology, that doing that heavy lifting, giving techniques and stuff. And once you get all that in place, then astrology always takes a leap. Always takes a leap. You know, that's what we've started talking about, when you can read a chart like a computer can read the chart, you know, like that, but there's no leap there. And we know that that's a computer report. And they can be very interesting and really insightful, but they're an algorithm.
Right.
But with a human reading a chart, is you do the heavy lifting with your education in astrology, what things mean and the nuances and the background and the cultural setting. And then once you get all of that done, that gets you to a certain place. And then you can take that intuitive leap. You know, then you can think, you can see the pattern. You think, I think it's going to work like that because they've done this before and they've done that over there and that goes that. So this is probably what's going to happen. And that to me is the lark. But there's no point. I've seen astrologers try and do that, use their wonderful intuition, using it without necessarily knowing a lot of astrology. Right. And so then they sort of leap in the wrong direction, or they can only take a leap, which heavy lifting, good astrological education would take you way past. Do you know? Sort of.
Absolutely.
So that's the reason for that story, which I put right in the front of the book. And to me, that book is the eagle. It's the heavy lifting, because what I try to do with that is, okay, you got all this stuff, let's organize it, let's lay it out. You know, the idea of that time map. All of that, all those techniques in the book come from my frustration of working with clients. Like, you're working with clients, you're tired, it's the third one of the day, you know, you're starting to think, oh, when will this finish? Or this person annoys me, or you know what I mean?
Right.
You're not working at your best, and you're trying to for the sake of the client. And it's very easy, particularly someone like me with my Mercury, which is the same as yours, is to totally confuse something and get it wrong. So I thought, I have to lay out things really clearly for me. I have to lay it out. So I'm not going to get confused. I don't need too much on the page. I'm thinking predictive work now. I need something that will pull it all together so I can see it all in relationship and simply see it. And if I've got too much there, I'm going to get confused. So strip it down, strip it down, strip it down. Keep it simple, keep it simple.
For example, in the transits parts where you break down in tables and you're looking at the, you know, the house ruling positions, and you're kind of ordering, and you've got this wonderful method how you piece it together.
Because you see, if you step back from if you're doing predictive work, you're trying to predict an event. There's a whole lot of philosophy we can talk about that, you know, like, but let's just keep it simple. We're saying you're trying to see into the future, right? And if you're thinking that you're seeing an event, a possible event, a potential event that's being symbolized, not necessarily dictated, but symbolized, then if you look at the philosophy of an event, and an event always, it comes out of the blue generally, but it always has a precursor and it always has a consequence. And if you can focus on the precursor, you can quite often estimate what the events, how it's going to take shape, you know. So to me, those sorts of, where is it coming from, where will it affect, so they're logical, they belong to houses, because that's what houses are all about in a chart. So to me, if I could organize it, it's coming from this area of your life, it manifests here, and the knock-on effect, the consequences of that. Now, given that the consequences are this, how do you think that's going to work in your life? Let's talk about that together. And, you know, let's look at the scenarios. So I do most of my predictive work by actually going way in the front and then backtracking, right? Because it's easier, you know, you do that with the client. But yes, that's where that transit grid, I call it a transit grid, comes from. And then that goes, you can link that onto a time map, which is what basically that with the progressions, and then the lunar phasing, which is really important for me. And then I'd always back that up with a 5-year transit graph as well, because if you, you know, if you see a whole stack of if you have a whole stack of difficult, the modern life, if you have a whole stack of difficult transits, but the next year they're all gone, the next year is fine, then the difficult transits are not death and destructions of one's family, you know, unless they're a psychopath or something, you know, like unless they don't care if things go wrong. If you, I'm sure you know this, if you get a string of difficult transits that go on for about 3 years or so, you know, and Neptune to Saturn and Pluto,
especially those
Saturn,
outer, slower moving planets that take an age, and you're like, when will you go away?
and powerlessness and hopelessness, then you're looking at big issues. Then you crank it up, then you're looking at big issues, because the person's going to take a few years to get through it. So, you know, you can actually tell a lot about this year by looking at 4 years from now, you know? I could go on for hours about that.
Oh no, I love it. I love it. Again, it must be Mercury Pilot. We could go boundless. Well, it actually brings me to another question that's probably a bit more specific, but looking at, we're talking about then, we're alluding to essential dignities. Now, if you're having students in 101, which we do at Kepler, as people get introduced into more traditional astrology and looking at dignities and debilities, what advice would you be? Because I notice students who maybe tend to panic, or if they see their chart full of planets in fall or accidentally debilitated or detriment, and of course, our own special Mercury with detriment and fall, which has its issues. I tend to waffle on, but What would your advice be to either people learning or panicking about their what would you say to that?
That's a very good question, Callum, because I get that as well. I love the essential dignities. Our literature from essential dignities comes from medieval astrology. Well, it's earlier than that, but we get most of our material from medieval astrology. And when you look at that material, it's talking about the one that's outcast in some way. So back in the 12th century or so, if you're the only Jewish kid in the village and something goes wrong, there's a good chance you're going to cop the blame. So if something's going wrong, who does society blame, etc.? They'll blame the outsider or the alternative or the different one. So fortunately, in most, it's not always, but fortunately in the cultures that you and I live in, anyway, I think I can say that if we are alternative, it's not necessarily life-threatening.
Right.
And I think that's a big one. So
you're seen as a bit of an eccentric, and I'm sure people raise eyebrows at what I do, but if they don't understand, then I'm like, okay, that's fine, but not life-threatening.
Right. So if a planet is in detriment or fall, and there is a difference, let's just say detriment, which is opposite rulership, it is contraire. It is, the way it functions is not mainstream. It'll do it differently. So, an alternative Jupiter will follow alternative spirituality religions or something like that. I mean, I'm just making that up as I go along, obviously.
Sure.
But it's alternative in some way. And that is not life-threatening nowadays. Right. And I haven't done the research work into it, but I would suspect, and this is just a hunch, that astrologers have more planets in detriment and fall than the average Yogi Bear, shall we say?
Interesting. I think that,
because we pursue an alternative subject, an alternative lifestyle. There are going to be some that don't have any in detriment fall. That's obviously could happen as well. So I would say to your students that a planet in detriment or fall is a statement about that in that area of their life, they will seek alternative solutions, alternative positions. They will not be mainstream. And that is, I think, a blessing. I think it gives that diversity. In that regard, I consider that planets in detriment or fall are another form of dignity, but in a contraire world, whereas the planets that don't have any detriment or fall are sort of neutral. Fall is a little bit harder. Detriment is, I am determined to reach the top of that mountain, even if it kills me.
Right.
And no one else wants to climb it but me. I can equate to that to me and see it in my client work as well. Fall can be, I used to be at the top of that mountain and now I'm not, and I'm upset. Fall can be a little bit more despondent, a sense that I had that, even if they never had, but a sense of I had that, I could have had that, and I lost it, and now I'm.
That almost sounds a little bit more difficult in a way. I think you said despondency, because detriment, of course. I mean, I've got my Sun, Aquarius, and Mercury, etc., etc. Well, that's fall as well. But that sense of maybe my Aquarian nature, it's like I don't really care if I'm contrary. I don't really care if I'm the eccentric.
It's the Sun in Libra that's in fall. You see, if you think
the Sun in Libra,
the Sun in Libra in fall, because it's Aries is exaltation, and I'm going to generalize horribly here.
Oh, sure, because we've got other things to consider, but of course.
But Libra is always trying to say, is that all right? Do that right? Everything okay? Libra is trying. So in other words, they are, whereas Aries just like, I'm going there.
See you later, bye-bye.
So Libra is insecure, generalized statement. Librans are insecure in their sense of who they are and their personal identity. And if you sit with that and really unpack it and think about Libra, you can get an insight into planets in fall. Do you know, like there's a sense of, I need to network and connect up and be supported by, do you know, because I need to be reinforced. And they won't necessarily be conscious of that. And I'm being incredibly simplistic, so I apologize straight away to all Librans who are watching this. But it's just an interesting way to think. And you can see that contrast with the Aries sun. If there's nothing else in the chart, then, you know, you've got that determination to go forth no matter what, sometimes to the dire consequences of the individual, but the love of challenge. That means incredible self-confidence. You know, it's like the sun in Leo, self-confidence. And so yeah, the sun signs can be interesting because they can give us insights into the meanings of detriment and fall. But getting back to your original question, you know, I would share with any astrology student, if you've got planets in detriment or fall, they're a blessing, because they are the way that you think differently or act differently or function differently. And those differences make you who you are. I think they do. So, yeah, a planet is always, there's no such thing as a bad planet, you know?
Right. But I think that's such a beautiful and eloquent way of explaining that. And I can't wait for students and others to view this and hear your words, because I think that's really profound. And for me, makes a lot of sense in those terms as well. So seeing it as that silver line, that blessing that it is in doing things differently, maybe to the mainstream and to others.
Yes, it's a and this is where, if astrologers keep studying astrology and thinking about it, bringing critical thinking to it, bringing it into our culture, can really help to understand an astrology from any period. Astrology is very culturally relative. That's why it's got such phenomenal long legs. That's why we've had it as soon as we've had humans crawling out of caves or down from trees, we've had different forms of astrology, and we always will, because it's our way of engaging with the sky. I mean, there's another whole dialogue there, because astrologers, if polemics against astrology, particularly from the 1950s and 60s, etc., and even right up into the 1990s, tend to imply that the astrologer wants to be dictated to. Do you know, the authoritarian sky and determinism, and they just take orders and they just do
Right.
and it's the exact opposite, that astrologers are cantankerous, independent sods. Do you know what?
Cantankerous is a great word for it.
Yeah. That, you know, as a collective, we want to understand our own lives and those others that we live. We do not want the establishment answers. We will not accept the why it is so. We'll figure that out for ourselves. Thank you very much. Do you know?
I love that.
There's that sense of independence and pursuing of thinking and action without reference to other politics or culture or so on. Do you know, like, and that's why it is culturally sensitive, because whatever is the current theme that's happening in the culture, astrology can filter into that and provide a framework to discuss it. And that's probably a good way to think about it.
And that's an interesting point, and it kind of leads to another question of where astrology has been maybe since the 70s, or when you started, to where it is now, and maybe where you think we're heading in maybe in the next 20, 40, 100 years, and like the cycles we kind of go through. Like that's a very long question. I don't know how to dissect that. But, like,
I mean, it's easier to look back, obviously, even as astrologers. I mean, I like looking forward as well. To looking back, that I came into astrology in the 70s, right? It was, one emerged out of the 60s, shook one's head and thought, okay, right.
What happened there?
what happened there? And if you remember, you weren't there. Right?
I know, true.
And it was a time of excitement. The Gorkelen data was coming out. People were getting excited. There was a real sense of optimism that astrology would, now that computers were coming in, they came in the mid-80s, that that astrology would finally be proven statistically. You know, there's all of that. And there was this pursuit of data, the building of databases. That was the engine room that many astrologers were engaged with. And that was
culturally.
then, of course,
I know you said mirroring culture. As I know you said mirroring culture, but why do you think culturally there was a big thing about data then at that point? Was there anything that was speaking to you at that point?
Computers were just coming into
because of the computers coming in. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Right.
And I mean, in 1975, or could have been 1976, it was an amazing year, and I can't find any reason for it astrologically. Liz Green published her first book, Rob Hand published his first book, and Alan Oken published his first book.
Wow.
Yeah, in 1 year.
What a year.
Yeah. And that was, it's an amazing year. So, astrology was exciting. There was an excitement, and it was all about, it's just about to happen. Yeah, it's just about to happen. Yes, that sort of thing. Now, it didn't happen in that regard. That's just historical fact. And I really, really totally accept what Patrick Curry said at that time, or just after that time. He just said, if astrology was proven statistically, it would lose its soul. And I thought that was a very profound statement, which I sat with for quite some time thinking about. Because what I came to realize is the same thing, but not as eloquently put as Patrick Curry put it. He wrote that, I think he wrote that in the AA journal just after. So it went into we sort of crawled our way through the 80s, so to speak. And still you had to find publishers to publish your work. There was no real internet. There was an internet. And so it was book driven, and astrologers were people of the book. And in that regard, what you would do then, and what generally astrologers did, is they would focus on one or two authors and they'd read thoroughly. And then you would discuss it. When you went to conferences, you would discuss Liz Green's new book, or you would discuss, case studies and so on like that, and drilling down into a particular line an astrologer was taking, for example. And then as we shifted into the 90s, hindsight happened. So there was a new wave of, maybe this is it.
This is a new frontier.
This is the blind optimist. This is me. Maybe this is it. And hindsight was absolutely fantastic. I bought everything in hindsight. I think they're all there.
Wonderful.
I just, as soon as it came out, I just gave them my credit card and bought everything and read everything. And that was that really deepened my astrology incredibly, but it affected a lot of people. But what actually then happened is that astrology started to split. Astrology tends to fragment anyway, but astrology started to split between those who went totally medieval and saw that as the only, as salvation, and redemption, and those that actually followed more the psychological line, which the faculty took up. Margaret Hone and then, of course, Liz Green followed that line, and the CPS and the psychological line, and that sort of drew a division almost, which sometimes got antagonistic, sometimes got stressful. And writing the book on the predictive astrology, which we talked about earlier, that tended to cast me into the non-psychological camp. But I've never really sat in either camp. I've always seen myself as just a humanist astrologer, just, if anything, I'm more Dame Rudyard than anything else, sort of that sort of line. But it did make that division between the astrologies. And then in the late 90s, and this is obviously my own personal opinion, and other people have other points of view, which is absolutely fine. The spiritualism or esoteric astrology or spiritual astrology that Alan Oken promoted, he was a wonderful, wonderful chap. really, I knew Alan quite well, and he was great. I didn't go along with his astrology, but he was just a terrific person, and consistent. And what I like about astrology, I don't care what their astrology is, as long as they're consistent in their philosophy and they're genuine in their soul. Do you know, astrology has many houses, and as long as you are genuine and passionate about the one you're in, that's absolutely fine. So Alan was totally genuine with that, but it sort of got distorted, not by Alan, but it sort of got into this sense of, for some groups of astrologers, that they were more evolved than others, and then started to get a hierarchy coming in. And I thought that was a real sad. There was a sadness there. I thought, for me, that was sad.
But that sounds sad, like for any sort of self-fulfilling or sense of superiority, and I get that shouldn't be involved in astrology, you know, I think, or being more
just
it sounds
that
sad.
They've got the answers and that they're more involved than their client or something like that. And that astrology doesn't deal well with arrogance.
Exactly.
That if you've got someone,
as we were talking about before, we're sat there underneath the stars, and I'm thinking, I have no idea what's going on. So that humble side, you know.
That's right. I mean, I think we're just messengers or servants, or in the service thereof, or you call it what you want. But I have, over the many years, quite a few, if there's arrogance and ego strutting the stage, it doesn't last very long. You know, you can fool some of the people some of the time, type of thing. And then as you pushed into the 2000 years, because the internet starts to come through very strongly, and we actually get astrology goes online, in a sense, which is fantastic. It's great. But what it has meant at the moment is that there tends to be, and I'm not blaming anybody, cherry picking. People go onto, first of all, you go onto a website, and if you're new to astrology, you go onto a website and you don't know if the person who's promoting themselves has been doing it, has read one book and decided to put a website up, or if they truly are an astrologer, capital A.
And that's really hard to discern, and it brings another great point up. What are your thoughts on, you know, regulation in astrology? Because as you're saying, the issue now, again, it's great that astrology is tapping into the zeitgeist. At the moment, there's a lot of, you know, social media, so your TikToks and your YouTubes and stuff. But what I found is, and I don't know if the hearts are in the right place, I'm sure for many of them that are, but I noticed maybe some astrologers out there, like you said, maybe you read a book or two, then all of a sudden they're profound astrologers predicting all these things, putting it all out there. So whether that's in not articles, but bits and pieces on the internet or videos that people produce, like how important is it for like getting a grounding and a fundamental grounding in astrology and, you know, certification? What are your thoughts around these topics?
Well, I'm absolutely in favor of it, although I recognize at times it's a hiding to nothing. Do you know, like I'm absolutely in favor of solid astrological education, with a solid educational group. Doesn't matter whether they can be in horary astrology or medieval astrology or psychological astrology, or, you know, there's no room for fundamentalism in astrology. Just, you know, like you've got to, we're a broad church, a very, very broad church. I'm totally in favor of that. Though at the moment, it's an uphill battle, because there's the feeding fest of the internet. And someone thinks, well, you know, why should they see someone else strutting their stuff and making stuff and self-publishing? Well, there was a time where the fact that it was a book that was published meant that it had gone through a form of peer review, you know, like, and you had a publisher. That's how I connected up with Wiser's, that I would buy Wiser books because I knew that they would be creditable books when I was a self-teaching student, you know, like learning.
And so of course, because yourself, you straddle the academic world with your PhD, so you've lived in the world of having to do peer review, to defend dissertations, to do those kind of things, and it's not in the same realm as
no, you see, but astrology used to be, because I sent the Eagle and the Lark to Betty at Wiser's. I didn't know her then. It's just that Wiser's were the publishers I loved, and that they accepted it. Do you know, like, and so that in its sense is that sense of a review,
a peer-reviewed approval,
yeah.
or
So you could buy books by a decent publisher, and that was good. Whereas nowadays people self-publish, which on one, there's pluses and minuses. But what I would recommend to anybody wanting to learn astrology is to buy books from reputable publishers. That's the first thing. And look for astrologers that cite other astrologers. The other thing that drives me crazy, Callum, astrologers pretend that everything's just made up from their head today. You are allowed to say, based on Liz Green's arguments, I'm moving this forward, and you
exactly.
are allowed to stand on the shoulders of the people who've gone before you. Not that Liz has gone.
Sure, and you should stand on the shoulders of giants and credit where credit is due.
Many people don't. Like I think I'm old-fashioned. Everybody should read Rudyard. Everybody should be aware of Alan Leo. Incredibly deterministic, but it's the foundation of spiritual astrology in this country and psychological astrology. Do you know that in England? So these are they should read these big names and then make their minds up, but recognize where they're coming from. I did, for my PhD, I did it on fate, belief in fate, and in the English-speaking world. So I went, Australia, South Africa, different parts of Europe, USA, Canada, England, of course, blah blah blah. Where they spoke English, I was there. I got about 2,000 astrologers to do the survey, and I interviewed about 21 astrologers. But the ones I interviewed were all the what I consider the leading lights in that area. So Liz Green, Alan Okins, you name it. But the names that shaped the field. And that was extraordinary because I had suspected it so, but it made me realize that within the broad church of astrology, there's some really differing beliefs. And basically 50% of astrologers believe, for example, that their soul is not in the chart, that their free will is off there. And 50%, this is rough, but it's within a decimal point, believe the soul is in the chart. Right. And those two different positions are very different. One's Platonistic and one's Stoic. Do you know, and from that, many other things grow. And there's only about 4% of astrologers, this is back 2008, 4% of astrologers who were really deterministic. Do you know, this will happen, full stop. Now, thank God there's only 4% of those. Right? But yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing is, if you're at a conference, if you're talking to another astrologer, there's a good chance they will have an utterly different view of what the chart can and can't say, and whether they have free will or not, and how they use that free will, and what is the role of astrology. And talking to other astrologers about those sorts of questions is really interesting, because it shows us that astrology is a broad church. It enables a person to bring their own instinctual beliefs about how the world works and gives it a home.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful description. I think that's part of the reason why we wanted to create this Leaders in Astrology series with people like yourself and other leaders, again, but to have these established people who've done an incredible body of work as yourself and other, but again, coming from different parts and different churches of astrology and speaking to that. And again, schools like Kepler, where you go through, the fundamental programs. If you want to do a diploma, you can go through. But even in 101, our introduction into astrology, I'm there as an assistant, but we have two other fantastic astrologers, Donna Young and Vanessa Lundberg. But even when we're doing labs or delineating charts or helping students, we're all coming from different lenses, as you're saying, from different points of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And that it has to be respected, but also I believe astrologers should be aware of the lens that they have and not assume that everybody else has that lens. Do you know? And that's a key thing. So yeah, I could digress down that lane.
Oh, sure, I love it. I love digressions. So let me. What was my next question? I totally forgot where I am. See, that's why I'm digressing. So I think because you've done so much. I mean, from your books to your software development to courses and lectures. What accomplishments are you most proud of, would you say?
as a practicing astrologer, the fixed star work. Also, I'm very proud of my eclipse work. I'm very pleased with that.
Wonderful.
My approach to the eclipses, which is in the Eagle and the Lark. Astrologically, they're two things that I would like to see live on, you know. I'm just in the midst of writing an academic book on the fate as within the astrological community, which I really want to get out, and that'll be happening through the Sapphire Centre. And although, you know, many astrologers won't be bothered with that, I mean, I do get a little bit despondent because many astrologers don't have a critical mind, or don't choose to use a critical mind or question it. Fortunately, there's enough astrologers that do. But it's
really
I'm working on that.
topic.
Reminds me, I didn't finish the question of the future. I actually think the future, because astrology is cyclic, right? Is that somewhere along the line, I can't say when, but there will be a resurgence of wanting to get it right again. Do you know? So turning to get qualifications, turning to get not academic qualifications like KeplerCollege, the faculty here, you know, those rising up again in strength. I mean, the faculty's going well, but you know, like it's sort of getting more and more credence, and the general a greater desire to work with astrologers who are more solid in their knowledge. And I can because that was what I came through, and then it's gone loose now, and it will come back again. Do you know? It will.
In these cycles which we go through, and you've made the point before of again reflecting the culture, because I think I heard you somewhere talking about, for example, the 80s where everything was just thrown into a chart, and just different cycles that astrology seems to go through, and it's interesting following that.
Yes. So I think it will go in that direction, and then people will turn back to these books. I mean, just last year, Wise's republished another edition of the Eagle and the Lark as one of their classic books, which I was really quite, oh wow, you know, like that was lovely. But you know, people will go back to some of these standard texts, and there's a few of them about, and they'll become what they stand on. Because when I was first learning, you would go back and with reverence go back to Raja, do you know, like long dead by my time, but you know, like names like that were held revered, and I think that will happen again. And you know, so because that's just the way the cycles actually flow.
And back to them, and then again building on giants, and of course your name along with other, you know, legendary, I know you don't like the word legendary, but you know, wonderful, renowned, important astrologers, and having those names, and again, it's fun. Can I ask another question as well? Do you still work with clients? Do you still?
I don't know.
Okay.
What actually happened is it's all the fixed stars' fault. We moved to what happened in the early 2002 is the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology started, and I was deeply drawn to that. I'd been coming over to England once a year for the last 10 years and doing a lot of travel anyway, lecturing in astrology. So I decided that I wanted to do it. So we actually relocated and moved to England, myself and my partner, and I did that MA, and then that led to a PhD, but that then led me now pursuing, I sort of finished that and then went back to pursuing my fixed star thinking, which all roads kept leading me to Egypt. All roads kept going back into Egyptian thinking.
Wow.
And I thought, I've really got to explore this further. So I'd done a lot of private study, you know, pyramid texts and things like that.
Wow.
And I decided if I really wanted to, and everything I read in it, I wasn't happy with the way things were being regarded. I'll put it that way, or the lack of the sky in the Egyptology text. So I thought, if I've got to make a comment, I've got to get more deeply into this. So I've just finished an MA with Manchester University in Egyptology.
Oh, wow.
Just done that.
Mm.
And the project that's on my plate is a book on Egyptian religious astronomy.
Wow.
Because what's the singularly most beautiful thing is that in the Pyramid of Unas, which is 2,500 BCE, on the walls and hieroglyphs, so it's a complete set, is the first and oldest rendition or story or narrative or theology of the soul's ascent to the stars.
Mm.
The Egyptians gave us the soul that we have today, in the modern West, and they gave us the idea that the soul ascends to the stars, and they wrote about it, and they wrote about it describing naked eye astronomy, what the stars actually do, but in their own language. And so that's my passion, really, because in Egyptology, it seems to me that the stars are not being heard as they should be, shall we say, in Egyptology. So, right, that's what I'm working on now. So
wonderful.
Yeah. So that's.
Is there a timeline? You're working on your book now. Is there a timeline for?
I've got 3 books on the go. I've got the book on fate, which I'm working through. I've got the religious astronomy book. They call it I would call it cultural astronomy, because astrology is cultural astronomy. It's how the sky affects the culture. But in Egyptology, they don't sort of know that term, but they know the term religious astronomy. So I can wear that T-shirt, and they're happy with that. So I'm working on that. And then the other night, I just had an email, and I had a very, very dear friend that died about 10 years ago, unexpectedly. And they were halfway through a book which was involved in cultural astronomy, in archaeoastronomy, actually. And they approached me and asked me to finish it. And I thought, wow, that's a real privilege to do that for her. Do you know, and so, yeah, so that's my current workload. And then, of course, I'm teaching the MA at TSD, Trinity St David in University of Wales.
How do you find enough hours in the day to do all that you do?
Yeah, well, I do I calm myself down using Rubik's cubes. I do. I have them all over my desk. But I love that. I mean, in the we're just starting the module in sacred skies, and that's fantastic. That's actually engaging the students with the sky and looking at different ways. It makes the sacred buildings, landscapes, lives. Astrology fits into that. So that's the module which is starting. But yeah, I love working with the MA, because you just meet fantastic people. It's all online. They're all over the world. And they're thinking. I just love it when people are thinking.
Critical, again, coming back to that critical thinking, asking questions and writing that. Absolutely.
And they come up with fantastic papers or fantastic ideas, and this, that's great. So, I mean, the other area I've published in with my partner and another colleague from another university is the orientation of Cistercian abbeys all through England, Wales, Ireland, etc. And finding their relationship to the sun, which is adding to Cistercian studies, which is really I love that. You give me an old church, a ruined building, or something like that, and I'm into it. That's why I sent you the picture from Ireland of myself in that dolmen, because I was surprised to see it, and I think that was the beginning of falling in love with megalithic landscapes and so on. So yeah, I mean, I love astrology, but I don't see clients now. I just haven't got time. But my interests have broadened out considerably into how the sky engages with human life. So astrology is definitely one part of it, but it's got so many other expressions, which I think are fascinating, singularly interesting, and really beautiful. Beautiful is the wrong word. There's a deep sense of properness when a building has a particular orientation to the sun on particular days, which are important.
Absolutely.
And there's sort of a sense of engagement with sky and land and building and theology and people. Do you know, like they come
Absolutely,
together.
yeah. There's something, yeah. I like the properness. I like that. There's a
Yeah,
great description for it. That's amazing.
yeah.
So it sounds like you've got a lot of things going on. So I've got just a couple more questions for you. I know your time is precious. So what we'd like to ask as well is what advice would you give to up and coming astrologers, maybe starting out in their practice? So for all the years of experience that you've had and the journey that you've taken on, is there any words of wisdom or any advice you would share to those just starting out, maybe in their practice, or what would you say to those people?
Yeah, and the way I started out was different to the way someone would do it nowadays with the
True.
internet and so on. But genuineness, honesty, humbleness, they are the features that make a great astrologer. They are the features that clients will keep coming back to. Openness. I would say to a client, when you come back next year, bring your predictive work back. And what we'll do is we'll go through it retrospectively and we'll see how it's worked for you. And tell me if it hasn't worked. That's really important. Because together we'll work out how it is working for you, and then we can move that forward. So that sense of you're working together with the client, you're not dictating to the client, you're not being the Oracle of Delphi, you're working together with them. And that sort of sense of openness and humbleness. Yeah. I mean, when I was working so hard with clients, people say, oh, you're a great astrologer, or that sort of thing. Or other astrologers get jealous and say I'm just psychic and didn't know any astrology, or do you know, like there'd be all sorts of things like that.
Wow.
And you just ignore it and just keep working. And the people say, you know, how did you get so good at astrology? You say, well, I work at it, but also it's I'm just a servant of it. Do you know, like it's work, and you engage with it. Astrology takes participation. I don't know if that's a word you use at KeplerCollege. Lucien Levy-Brewer, French anthropologist, 1940s or so, he was killed in an air raid. But he wrote a wonderful book back in the 20s, How Natives Think, and it's written in that sort of language, so it can be quite offensive when you start to read it, because it's the primitive mind, etc. But what he actually did was he slowly brought the thinking from looking at how tribal people function, and then slowly realizes how everybody functions that way. It's not just that group, you know. But what he basically pointed out and unpacked was that if you engage with a pattern, you engage with a culture, you engage with the forest, you engage with the community's beliefs or whatever, then it awakens it and it engages with you. And astrology is like that. The more you engage with it, the more it reaches back to you, and you get into a rhythm with it. So your life is in step with it, and so it works for you, putting it that way. And that gives your life a sense of purpose and understanding, so you can move with it. If you disengage, or if someone's not engaged with it, then they haven't got that rhythm. Students learning, what happens is they're interested, but they haven't got the rhythm, and they come into it, and as they learn it, and I'm sure you've seen this, they will have an epiphany. They go, yeah, my God, I had a Saturn transit now, my God, you know? And that's the meld. Wonderful. That's when they begin to participate. From that point on, it grows deeper and stronger in them.
And I love that. It's those, even for myself, many moons ago, getting involved. And not only was it a week of treasure trove every week, just going the aha moments, but there's certain light bulb moments, or you see something, and like you said, it's just like a lightning bolt, and it blows my mind, and I'm like, how on earth does this work? How is this possible? But it is, and as you say, I must be becoming in sync with the patterns and the complexities with what
it takes the epiphany. Every student will have that epiphany, and that is where it sinks. right? The locking, Chevron 8 locks in, do you know? Like, and then there is a rhythm between the person's life and the heavens and vice versa. It's a dialogue, and it's beautiful. It's fantastic. You can step out of it, you can step into it. Once you've done that, you can do that. So getting back to students of astrology, they should understand that. They should, and what they're doing when they work with clients is they're helping their clients. They're acting as a bridge for their clients to have that rhythm. And it's a delicate balance because the client's got to also learn that they're in control of that. They shouldn't be dependent upon the astrologer.
Right.
They shouldn't. Right. It's not that sense of you're not trying to hook a customer in for life. Do you know, like?
And I think that it goes on to the issues of like ethics in astrology. Things like do no harm, or don't try and be the all-seeing, the seer who they depend on, sort of thing.
Yeah. So it's that sense of understanding that participation, understanding the role of being a bridge, helping a person see that, discussing their future with them in a conversation, not a monologue, using the eagle as much as possible, and being honest when you really get it wrong. I mean, the whole of my eclipse work came out of one consultation where I got it so wrong, it was unbelievable.
Wow.
I had a regular client, and he was going off on a holiday to Scotland. I'd done his work, it was nothing, everything, ticking along, normal sort of stuff. And what he did was he was coming back from Scotland. He bought a haggis back into Australia, not realizing that you couldn't do that,
Yeah, you can't,
and he didn't declare it. He didn't declare it, and he got caught. Now, okay, you think, all right.
And Australia is very strict, are they? On
you think, a fine or whatever,
sure,
like you lose the haggis, a fine, rap over the knuckles, fine. The problem was he was a local council member. He was an elected official, and the offence meant he could no longer continue. He couldn't be elected. So it's a major freaking crisis. Right? He came back to me and he said, "You did not spot any problems." I thought, "You're dead right, Gov. I didn't. You're absolutely right."
Yeah.
And the only thing he had was a reasonably an eclipse, not doing very much in the star, the solar eclipse just occurring. I can't remember the exact configuration. I thought it's the only thing. Anyway, I just simply apologized. I mean, what can you do? You can't,
of course,
And he was decent about it, but it was really interesting. So I spent about a week tearing it apart, trying to see. I went through primaries, tertiary progressions, you name it.
All the way down to tertiary and the finer tuning.
You name it, I did it.
Sure.
And normally I never do that because I think if astrology speaks, it speaks at the larger levels. You don't have to drill down.
Right. But you were just determined to think what was going on.
Why? Because this, it should have showed this change in life direction, which this minor event was causing. Anyway, so it was just, I started drilling down to this eclipse. And at that stage, what you did with an eclipse is you had the eclipse and you had the eclipse chart and you sort of did a synastry with the person's chart, Now with that, you can make it say anything, like you throw enough planets in and astrology will confess to anything, so, you can't sort it out. So it made me pursue the geometry, which we all know as kids, the geometry in eclipse, but pursue the deeper geometry of the whole sense of the cycles of the eclipses, which was the Saros cycles. And there's an astrologer, a Canadian astrologer called Carl Jensky, in the early 80s had written in a book where he'd mentioned Saros cycles in eclipses. Didn't do much with them from memory, but he mentioned it and I picked up on that. Went to the library. That was the days you went to the library. And researched it and found Saros series. Anyway, the long and the short, I was able to, this is before NASA had their wonderful website because there wasn't even a web. Right. I was able to find that each series had a beginning, had a birth chart. So I started working with the birth charts of those. And that birth chart for the eclipse that my client had was absolutely nailed what had happened to this guy.
Wow.
And it had, I can't remember, I'm going to make this up, it was something like it was conjunct his sun, or it was conjunct the moon, or
Sure.
to the ruler of the MC. It was making a strong hit. But by itself, in its current rendition, it was pretty mild.
Right.
But in its birth chart, it had big teeth, and it totally described it, because eclipses run in families, and each member of the family will have a similar theme to it.
Right.
Do you know that you can pick up historical themes running through a cycle with them? But yeah, so that led to all the work I've done on eclipses from that one client.
Wow.
So my point of sharing that story with you is that if you ask the client, how did the astrology work, the predictor would work for you? You know, what happened? You had this Saturn transit. We talked about this. We reckoned it was going to do X. Talk to me. How did it work? Now that helps you as the astrologer,
right?
Because you learn, right?
Yeah.
But it helps the client as well, because sometimes you can help the client see how it has worked when they don't think it has worked, but you can see them how it has worked, and that helps them understand their own astrology and participate more. So it's a good conversation to have. But sometimes you just get it wrong, and when you get it wrong, you have to not try and smudge that. You have to think, wow, I got it wrong. What causes it to go wrong? Did I get it wrong because all the areas of the life is going to happen, the house systems? All right, using the wrong house system, or right, wrong time to the chart. Maybe something like that. Or maybe just I really misunderstood what Saturn meant in that situation. Do more reading. But if you ask the clients for feedback on what you've done for them in the past, and discuss it with them and take it seriously and really own it and apply that feedback to your own astrology, your astrology leaps ahead. That makes you an honest, humble, ethical astrology. You won't necessarily be the wealthiest one. You won't be the glitziest one. You won't have the one with the fancy website that's conning everybody, etc. But you will do good work. And isn't that what it's all about? Speak as the Pisces here.
Absolutely. Your own integrity. And again, that I think the key word that you struck me with is being humble as well, because there's at times I think we're forever learning, but admitting those mistakes or just seeing that you're not going to get everything all of the time, sort of thing, and then admitting it to yourself, otherwise you're just lying to yourself.
Yes.
Otherwise,
yes.
And again, that sense of integrity, that sense of honesty, and asking questions as well, asking the questions and see what's gone, as you did with that fellow with the haggis, and seeing, well, you've actually dug down. It's like, what was going on? And not be afraid to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes, I think. I know I've made plenty of mistakes already. So
no, we all make them. Yeah. So that's what, and then what I have found is that if you are honest and humble and with those sorts of ethics and really trying to do the best you can for your clients, I've found, and maybe this is me just being idealistic or something, but I have found the astrology muse will never let you down. The astrology will reach forward, and you will have a home at its hearth, and it will look after you. Do you know, it will give you a life that you can enjoy and engage with in a meaningful way. Now, maybe that's just me talking, but I've found that with my other professional colleagues in astrology, that they're decent people and they're living decent lives. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But there's a sense of, they have purpose. There's a sense of solidness, and they're walking their path. And that's what I think astrology does. Astrology has a muse, or it has agency anyway, and so it lives with you. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think that's a beautiful message, and again, I just want to thank you. It's been such an honor and a privilege speaking with you today.
Callum, you asked easy questions.
Easy questions, but again, and this is why we're going to love doing this series, because I think, not to get ahead of myself or ourselves, but can you imagine if you could have video recordings of William Lilly, or when we didn't have the technology? But I'd love to see this be ageless, where maybe in 50 years, 100 years from now, people can look back, if they're reading the books, Eagle and the Lark and the fixed stars, and they're looking back like we read astrologers now, you know, ancient astrologers, to look back and look at recordings. And this is my Mercury in Pisces. I'm going off in different directions, but I'd love this to be just a great encapsulation of speaking with wonderful astrologers like yourself. So again, I'm very humbled and very privileged to have spoken with you today. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been an honor and a privilege, and I hope anybody who listens to this gets a few worthwhile tips out of it. Like,
absolutely, I'll be rewatching this myself several times. So the very final question is, where can people follow you? Do you have a website where, because I know you've got some books coming out soon? And...
Yeah, I have a website. I'm very, very bad at social media. I don't really do much Facebook.
Sure.
I have a website. It's just BernadetteBrady.com.
BernadetteBrady.com. Okay.
Yeah, and people can also, there's the astrological business, which I keep running, sells products and digital courses and teaching, and that's Astro Logos. And so if they look at astrologos.co.uk, they can always send a message to that through that, and that actually lands on my work computer. So I'll see that.
Wonderful. So if I put the link to your website,
I used to try and answer every question that landed. I just can't now.
Of course, yeah.
I just can't. So I apologize in advance. You know.
So if we put the link to your website below the video, that can link to, you know,
everything. If you put the link to Astro Logos, that would be the best site. Best way for people to reach
Astro Logos to link that site. Okay.
Yeah. Either one, but that's the best one. I'm trying to remember. I think my website directs people to Astro Logos anyway, so that would
we'll include that. Perfect. Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for
good luck with all the other interviews.
Oh, sure, yeah. I'm very much looking forward to
it. Okay. All right, Callum.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you so much.
You done? Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you
Thank
later.
you.